What if I told you that an entire civilization vanished so completely that for centuries people believed they were extinct, only to discover that their descendants had been hiding in plain sight all along? This is the incredible story of the Taíno people, and today we're diving deep into one of the most remarkable cultural revivals of our time. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media and suddenly see someone posting in a language you've never heard before. The words look familiar yet foreign, and you realize you're witnessing something extraordinary. This person is speaking Taíno, a language that was supposedly dead for over 500 years. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. Not only is this language making a comeback, but an entire culture that was thought to be completely erased is rising from the ashes like a phoenix. The Taíno people once flourished across the Caribbean islands, creating a sophisticated society that would make even modern civilizations envious. They had developed complex social structures, innovative agricultural techniques, and artistic traditions that were centuries ahead of their time. But when European colonizers arrived in 1492, everything changed in the most devastating way possible. What followed was one of history's most complete cultural genocides, so thorough that entire bloodlines, languages, and traditions seemed to disappear forever. But here's where this story gets absolutely fascinating, and why you need to stick around until the end. The Taíno people didn't actually disappear. They survived, adapted, and now, in the 21st century, they're reclaiming their heritage in ways that are reshaping how we understand identity, culture, and survival itself. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a modern miracle unfolding before our eyes. Let me take you back to understand just how incredible this revival truly is. When Columbus first encountered the Taíno in 1492, he was meeting members of one of the most advanced indigenous civilizations in the Americas. The Taíno had populated virtually every major island in the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico to Jamaica, from Cuba to the Dominican Republic. Their society was so well organized that they had established complex trade networks spanning thousands of miles of ocean, something that required remarkable navigational skills and social cooperation. The Taíno weren't just random groups of people scattered across islands. They had developed a sophisticated social hierarchy with caciques, or chiefs, ruling over communities that could include thousands of people. These leaders weren't just figureheads either. They were responsible for organizing massive agricultural projects, mediating disputes, and maintaining relationships with neighboring communities. The level of social organization was so advanced that Spanish chroniclers, despite their obvious biases, couldn't help but document their admiration for Taíno society. But what makes the Taíno story even more compelling is how they lived in harmony with their environment in ways that modern environmental scientists are only now beginning to fully appreciate. They had perfected a form of agriculture called conuco, which involved creating raised fields that could withstand hurricanes and floods while maintaining soil fertility for generations. This wasn't just smart farming. This was ecological genius that sustained populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands across multiple islands. Their spiritual beliefs were equally sophisticated, centered around a complex understanding of the natural world that recognized the interconnectedness of all living things. They believed in simons, spiritual forces that inhabited everything from trees to rocks to human beings. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was a philosophical framework that promoted environmental stewardship and social harmony in ways that many modern societies struggle to achieve. And their artistic achievements? Absolutely breathtaking. The Taíno created intricate petroglyphs that still cover cave walls and rock formations throughout the Caribbean. They crafted ceremonial objects from gold, wood, and stone that demonstrate not just technical skill, but profound aesthetic sensibility. Their cotton textiles were so fine that European colonizers immediately recognized their superior quality. These weren't people living in some primitive state. These were sophisticated artists and craftspeople whose work rivals anything produced in contemporary European workshops. So what happened to this remarkable civilization? This is where the story becomes heartbreaking, but understanding this devastation makes the modern revival even more miraculous. Within just a few decades of European contact, the Taíno population collapsed from an estimated 1 million people to fewer than 60,000. The speed and completeness of this demographic catastrophe is almost impossible to comprehend. Disease played a massive role in this collapse. The Taíno had no immunity to European pathogens, so smallpox, typhus, and influenza swept through their communities like wildfire. Entire villages would be wiped out in a matter of weeks, but disease alone doesn't explain the completeness of the cultural destruction that followed. The encomienda system established by the Spanish was essentially legalized slavery disguised as a labor arrangement. Taíno communities were assigned to Spanish colonists who were supposedly responsible for their Christian education and protection. In reality, this system forced the Taíno into backbreaking labor in gold mines and sugar plantations under conditions so brutal that many preferred death to continued enslavement. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. Spanish colonizers systematically destroyed Taíno religious sites, burned their ceremonial objects, and prohibited the practice of traditional customs. Children were separated from their families and forced into European-style education that explicitly aimed to erase their cultural identity. Speaking Taíno languages became dangerous. Practicing traditional ceremonies could result in severe punishment, and maintaining cultural connections became nearly impossible. But here's what the colonizers didn't anticipate: the incredible resilience of the human spirit. While official records documented the supposed extinction of the Taíno people, the reality was far more complex. Many Taíno individuals and families survived by adapting, hiding, and blending with other populations. Some retreated to remote mountainous areas where Spanish control was weaker. Others integrated with escaped African slaves or mixed with Spanish colonists while secretly maintaining elements of their cultural practices. This survival strategy required enormous sacrifice. It meant abandoning obvious markers of Taíno identity, speaking Spanish or other languages in public while perhaps maintaining some Taíno words within families, and practicing traditional customs in secret, if at all. It meant watching their rich cultural heritage seemingly disappear while doing everything possible to preserve whatever fragments they could for future generations. For centuries, this strategy worked so well that even the descendants of Taíno survivors often lost awareness of their heritage. Colonial authorities declared the Taíno extinct, historians accepted this narrative, and the world moved on as if an entire civilization had simply vanished without a trace. But genetic memory is stronger than colonial oppression, and cultural identity has a way of resurfacing even after centuries of suppression. The modern Taíno revival began quietly in the mid-20th century when individuals across the Caribbean started questioning official histories that seemed to leave gaps in their own family stories. DNA testing, anthropological research, and oral history projects began revealing the truth. The Taíno had never actually disappeared. This discovery sparked something extraordinary. People who had grown up identifying as simply Puerto Rican, Dominican, or Cuban suddenly began uncovering Taíno ancestry in their family lines. They started connecting with others who had similar discoveries, forming networks that spanned the entire Caribbean diaspora. What began as individual journeys of personal discovery evolved into a coordinated movement to revive and reclaim Taíno culture. The language revival has been particularly remarkable. Linguists working with community members have reconstructed significant portions of the Taíno language using Spanish colonial documents, comparative analysis with related Arawakan languages, and fragments preserved in Caribbean Spanish dialects. Young people are now learning to speak words their ancestors were forbidden to utter. Social media groups share daily Taíno vocabulary lessons. Cultural centers offer immersion programs that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. But this revival goes far beyond language. Taíno artists are reviving traditional pottery techniques, recreating ceremonial objects, and developing contemporary art forms that honor ancestral traditions while addressing modern realities. Musicians are incorporating traditional Taíno instruments and rhythms into contemporary compositions. Dancers are reconstructing ceremonial performances based on colonial descriptions and related indigenous practices from other Arawakan communities. The agricultural revival has been equally impressive. Community groups are re-establishing Canuco farming techniques, growing traditional crops like yucca, batata, and maize, using methods their ancestors perfected. These projects aren't just cultural exercises, they're practical efforts to promote food sovereignty and sustainable agriculture in communities that have often struggled with food security. Spiritual practices are being revived as well, though this aspect of the revival requires particular sensitivity and respect. Communities are reconstructing understanding of Simon traditions, establishing sacred sites, and developing contemporary spiritual practices that honor Taíno worldviews, while respecting the fact that religious traditions can't simply be reconstructed after centuries of interruption. What makes this revival even more remarkable is how it's navigating complex questions of authenticity and legitimacy that could easily derail such efforts. How do you prove Taíno ancestry when colonial records were designed to erase such identities? How do you revive cultural practices when the chain of traditional transmission was broken centuries ago? How do you distinguish between genuine cultural revival and romantic fantasizing about indigenous identity? The Taíno revival movement has approached these challenges with remarkable sophistication. Rather than claiming to perfectly recreate pre-contact Taíno culture, which would be impossible, community leaders emphasize continuity, adaptation, and contemporary relevance. They acknowledge that modern Taíno identity necessarily incorporates centuries of cultural mixing and evolution, while still maintaining connection to ancestral traditions and values. DNA testing has played a significant role in this process, but community leaders wisely recognize that genetic ancestry alone doesn't determine cultural identity. Instead, they emphasize cultural practice, community connection, and commitment to Taíno values as the primary markers of contemporary Taíno identity. This approach has helped avoid some of the pitfalls that have plagued other indigenous revival movements. The political dimensions of this revival are equally fascinating. In Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and other Caribbean territories, recognition of Taíno heritage challenges official narratives about national identity that have traditionally emphasized European and African ancestry while ignoring indigenous roots. Government recognition of contemporary Taíno communities remains limited, but cultural recognition has expanded dramatically. Educational initiatives have been particularly successful. Schools throughout the Caribbean now include Taíno history and culture in their curricula, often for the first time since colonization. University programs are developing Taíno studies courses. Museums are revising exhibits to acknowledge Taíno survival rather than promoting extinction narratives. The international dimension of the revival has also been crucial. Taíno communities have connected with other indigenous groups throughout the Americas, sharing strategies for cultural revitalization and political advocacy. These connections have provided valuable resources and legitimacy for Taíno revival efforts while building broader solidarity among indigenous communities. Social media has revolutionized how the revival movement operates. Facebook groups, Instagram accounts, and YouTube channels dedicated to Taíno culture now connect thousands of people across multiple countries. These platforms enable language learning, cultural education, and community building in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Young people who might never have learned about their Taíno heritage through traditional channels are discovering their ancestry and getting involved in revival efforts through online communities. The economic aspects of the revival deserve attention as well. Taíno cultural tourism has become increasingly important in several Caribbean destinations. Cultural centers offer classes in traditional crafts. Artists sell contemporary works inspired by ancestral traditions. These activities provide economic opportunities for community members while raising awareness about Taíno culture among broader populations. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Taíno revival is how it's changing fundamental narratives about survival, identity, and cultural continuity. The dominant historical narrative has always been that colonization successfully eliminated indigenous populations from most of the Caribbean. The Taíno revival demonstrates that this narrative was not only wrong, but actively harmful, as it prevented recognition of indigenous survival and continuity. This revision has implications far beyond academic history. It challenges legal frameworks that determine indigenous rights and recognition. It influences how contemporary Caribbean societies understand their own cultural heritage. It provides inspiration for other indigenous communities worldwide who are working to revive traditional practices after periods of suppression. The revival also demonstrates remarkable resilience and adaptability that offers lessons for cultural preservation efforts worldwide. The Taíno case shows that cultural identity can survive even centuries of active suppression if communities are willing to adapt while maintaining core values and connections. Looking toward the future, the Taíno revival faces both opportunities and challenges. Growing international recognition of indigenous rights provides a supportive context for continued cultural revitalization. Technological tools make language preservation and cultural education more accessible than ever before. Increased environmental awareness has created new appreciation for traditional ecological knowledge that Taíno communities preserved. At the same time, the revival movement must navigate ongoing questions about authenticity, legitimacy, and contemporary relevance. How do traditional practices adapt to modern urban environments? How do communities maintain cultural distinctiveness while participating fully in contemporary Caribbean societies? How do they balance respect for ancestral traditions with the need for continued cultural evolution? The Taíno revival also faces practical challenges, including limited funding for cultural programs, ongoing political resistance to indigenous recognition, and the simple difficulty of reconstructing complex cultural traditions after centuries of interruption. Community leaders must balance ambitious goals with realistic assessments of what can actually be accomplished with available resources. But despite these challenges, the momentum behind the Taíno revival appears unstoppable. Each year brings new discoveries about Taíno survival and continuity. Each generation produces young people more connected to their ancestral heritage than their parents could have imagined. Each cultural event, language class, and artistic performance strengthens the growing network of contemporary Taíno communities. This is why the Taíno story matters so much beyond the Caribbean. In an era of increasing globalization and cultural homogenization, the Taíno revival demonstrates that indigenous identities can not only survive, but thrive. It shows that colonization, no matter how thorough, cannot completely erase the human connections that define cultural identity. It proves that communities can reclaim their heritage even after centuries of suppression. The Taíno revival represents something profound about human resilience and the power of cultural memory. It reminds us that history is not just about what happened in the past, but about how we understand and reconstruct our identities in the present. It demonstrates that cultures are not museum pieces to be preserved unchanged, but living traditions that adapt and evolve while maintaining their essential character. As we watch this remarkable revival continue to unfold, we're witnessing something far more significant than just the resurgence of one indigenous culture. We're seeing proof that the human spirit refuses to accept extinction, that communities can overcome even the most systematic attempts at cultural genocide, and that identity has the power to transcend time, space, and colonial oppression. The Taíno people are not just reclaiming their past, they're creating their future. And in doing so, they're showing all of us what's possible when communities refuse to let their stories end, no matter how many powerful forces try to write the final chapter. This is not just Indigenous history. This is human history at its most inspiring. The Taíno are not just surviving. They're thriving, and their story is far from over.